Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're going to be exploring Ta-Nehisi Coates' latest book, The Message. Now, those of you familiar with Coates' work, he usually goes pretty deep into race and America. The Message kind of takes a different path. It's way more personal, a lot more reflective. It's almost like getting a sneak peek into Coates' thoughts, his struggles, as he makes his way through different parts of the world.
You know what I think is so interesting about The Message? It's how it's put together. It's basically like a bunch of notes, reflections that Coates wrote for his students when he was teaching writing at Howard. It feels like we're kind of peeking into his master class and getting all this great insight into his creative process and how his view of history is changing and his place in the world too.
It's fascinating how the book starts off. With Coates going back to Howard to teach writing. It talks about it being like coming full circle kind of gal. But at the same time, he feels a little weird about all the praise he's gotten over the years. Especially since he wasn't, the best student when he was there.
He even calls himself a middling student at one point, which is kind of funny when you think about it. This guy is a famous author now. He's won a National Book Award. He's got a MacArthur Genius Grant. But it says a lot about him, how humble he is. He's always looking at himself. You know what I mean? It makes you think, just because you're successful, it doesn't mean all those doubts go away.
It's definitely a reminder that even the most successful people are still learning and growing. And that openness, that willingness to say, hey, I'm struggling too, makes his insights even more relatable.
Absolutely. And speaking of journeys, the first one Coates takes us on is to Dakar, Senegal. It's his first time ever setting foot on the African continent. You can really sense, the weight of history, all the expectations he's carrying.
He even says he was afraid of finding what he calls black savagery. It's a pretty raw, honest admission. And it really shows how powerful the stories we've been told are about Africa and black people.
And that's where the light bulb moment comes in, that aha moment. As he's thinking about that fear, he realizes it's not actually his own. It comes from all the racist stuff that's been pushed on him his whole life. These limited, often harmful ways that Africa has been shown to him.
And then there's this amazing transformation. When he finally gets to Dakar, he says it feels like he's, quote, beaten history itself. You can practically feel the ocean breeze, that sense of coming home, as he walks along the beach, taking in the real Africa. It's nothing like the pictures he's seen.
It's powerful, After centuries of oppression and being displaced, there's still this deep need to connect, to belong, to understand where you come from.
And that need to connect, it leads him to explore his own name. He talks about how his dad chose Ta-Nehisi as this symbol of black self-determination, a rejection of the names forced on people during slavery. But Coates struggles with that legacy. He asks, can a name or any outward sign of civilization really define a person's worth?
Yeah, it is interesting, right? His dad picks that name, Ta-Nehisi, to show black self-determination. It's pushing back against the names forced on people during slavery. And yet, Coates still wrestles with that. It reminds us that even when we're moving forward, we can't escape what's happened in the past.
He seems to be looking for something deeper, a sense of human dignity that goes beyond labels and accomplishments. This leads to a really interesting story where he learns about the Senegalese fascination with the mixed look, a trait that's often linked to Black Americans.
It's not just fascination, though. Coates talks to a Senegalese man who tells him that the mixed look is seen as more desirable, more beautiful. And this preference for lighter skin, it reveals a chilling truth. The effects of the transatlantic slave trade, the sexual violence that came with it, it's still shaping ideas about beauty, even in Senegal.
It's a harsh reminder of how deeply rooted colorism is, how these ideas about beauty have spread all over the world. This exploration of history and identity takes Coates to another important place, Gorée Island.
It's become this symbolic place, the point of departure for enslaved Africans, even though historians have argued about its actual role in the slave trade. They point out that the number of people who actually went through the door of no return is a lot less than people originally thought.
Even knowing that, Coates is still deeply affected by the feeling of the place. He's caught between what he understands intellectually about Goré's role, the intense emotions he feels while he's there.
It's almost like the power of what the place represents is bigger than the actual historical facts, and it leads Coates to this interesting conclusion. We have a right to our imagined traditions, our myths, even if we know they're not perfect.
It makes you think about how we build our own stories, our understanding of history and who we are. We might find out that some of what we believe is based on incomplete or even wrong information, but that doesn't necessarily make it less important to us.
It's about recognizing the power of storytelling, how it shapes our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. And for Coates, that exploration of storytelling gets more personal as he thinks about his own experiences as a teacher.
He talks about teaching writing
Yeah.
in all sorts of different places, from a prison to the prestigious halls of Howard University. And it seems like he's always trying to figure out how to make learning both challenging and engaging, how to create a space where students can grapple with tough truths without feeling overwhelmed or like they can't speak up.
And this leads to a really interesting talk about safe spaces. Coates argues that these spaces aren't about protecting students from discomfort. They're about creating an environment where students feel strong enough to engage with difficult topics and question their own assumptions.
He even shares a story about a psychology professor at Howard who told his students straight up to never let racist arguments slide, challenge them head on.
That's a powerful lesson. It's not about shutting down opposing views. It's about engaging with them, thoughtfully and critically. It makes you think about how we handle tough conversations in our own lives. Do we avoid them? Or do we see them as chances to grow and understand?
Absolutely. And that challenge to engage with tough ideas becomes even more important as Coates talks about the backlash against words like the 1619 Project and his own book, Between the World and Me, especially in schools.
Yeah, it's alarming. Politicians, even some parents, are trying to ban these books from schools. They claim they make students uncomfortable or push divisive ideas. But what's really going on, they're trying to whitewash history, control the story, and silence voices that challenge the way things are.
Coates makes this issue real through the story of Mary Wood. She's a high school English teacher in South Carolina who was pressured to take Between the World and Me out of her class. Coates even goes to Chapin, South Carolina, to a school board meeting where Mary's facing this huge backlash.
What's striking is how the people trying to ban these books use the language of discomfort and safety as weapons. They say they're protecting students from harmful ideas, but really, they're trying to stop critical thinking. They don't want students to engage with complex and challenging issues.
Mary's story becomes this amazing example of how storytelling can be a form of resistance. She's standing up for her students' right to engage with a wider range of perspectives and ideas, even if it means risking her job.
It's inspiring to see people like Mary who are willing to push back against these attempts to control the narrative and limit what students can learn.
And from this exploration of education and censorship, Coates takes us on a totally different journey, this time to Israel and Palestine. You can feel a shift in his writing. He's dealing with a different kind of oppression and injustice. His tone becomes more somber, introspective.
One of the most powerful parts is his visit to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Center. He talks about this deep experience of confronting the horrors of the Holocaust, wrestling with memory and history. It's a reminder of the terrible things that can happen when intolerance and hate take over.
And as he travels through Israel and Palestine, he starts to see some unsettling similarities between Jim Crow segregation in the United States and the apartheid system he sees in Israel and Palestine.
It's important to understand he's not making a direct comparison. He's pointing out these systemic ways that one group of people is given preferential treatment over another, how those systems are kept in place, and how they affect the lives of those who are marginalized. And this leads him to look at the influence of Leon Uris's novel Exodus and its movie adaptation. He examines how they shaped how Americans see Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict, often portraying Palestinians as the bad guys and Israelis as the heroes.
He points out how this story really resonated with American audiences, especially during the Vietnam War. It reinforced this idea of righteous warriors defending their homeland against brutal enemies, which fed into this romanticized view of the IDF and the idea of purity of arms.
But Coates wants us to look past that romanticized view and see the reality of the occupation. He reminds us that this tendency to ignore the violence inflicted on others, to justify it in the name of security or national interest, is deeply rooted in American history, too.
He connects it back to our own country's history of colonialism and genocide, the way we've justified pushing out and oppressing indigenous peoples. It's a sobering reminder that we all need to take a hard look at the stories we've been told about our own history.
Exactly, and this brings us to one of the most heartbreaking stories in the book, Coates' meeting with Mr. Jaber, a survivor of the Ta-Nehisi massacre.
Mr. Jaber tells his own story about that day.
Yeah.
The brutal killing of his brother, being forced out of his home. It's a devastating reminder of the human cost of this conflict.
The way Mr. Jaber describes what happened, it's incredibly powerful. And even though he's faced this unimaginable loss, he still stresses the importance of education. He sees it as a way to resist, to remember, to make sure his family's story and the stories of so many others who've been displaced aren't forgotten.
Victor Jaber's story reminds us that every conflict has a human face, that behind the political speeches and the historical accounts are real people whose lives have been changed forever by violence and displacement.
It's a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit and the lasting power of storytelling to preserve history and challenge the dominant narratives.
We'll be back in part 2 to continue our deep dive into the message. We'll explore how Coates' understanding of his own writing is evolving, his search for truth and meaning, and his confrontation with the legacy of violence and oppression in both the United States and Israel and Palestine.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
So as we dig deeper into the message, we see Coates kind of wrestling with, the complexities of history and the limitations of his own work, too. Like, one really striking example is how his view on reparations has changed.
Yeah, it's interesting how, in the case for reparations, he initially made his argument by comparing it to, what Germany did, making reparations to Israel for the Holocaust. He actually admits he did that on purpose, thinking that a mostly white audience would connect better with an argument that used a historical wrong they already knew about.
But as he travels through Israel and Palestine and sees the occupation up close, he starts to question whether it's right to use one kind of injustice to fix another.
It's almost like he has this epiphany. Like he realizes the very systems he's criticizing are the ones he accidentally leaned on to make his point. It's a real moment of, looking inward, both intellectually and morally.
This leads him to a deeper understanding of how powerful storytelling can be, especially how it can be used to justify things that are just plain wrong. He uses Leon Uris's novel Exodus and the movie they made from it as a perfect example.
Right, Exodus makes this heroic story about the founding of Israel, but at the same time, it demonizes Palestinians and pretends their experiences don't matter. It spreads harmful stereotypes and turns a really complicated historical conflict into a simple good versus evil story.
And Coates points out that this story really stuck with American audiences, especially during the Vietnam War. It gave them a comforting image of, good soldiers fighting for their country against a bad enemy, which fit with how Americans saw themselves at the time.
It also added to that romantic view of the IDF, the purity of arms idea, that often makes people forget about the reality of the occupation.
But Coates doesn't let us off easy. He links this romanticizing of military force, this willingness to overlook violence against others, back to America's own history of colonialism and genocide. He reminds us that the stories we tell ourselves about our past often hide the ugly truth.
He's pushing us to really look at the stories we've been told, to face how those stories have shaped how we see the world, and to admit that our own history is full of oppression and injustice that we often ignore or downplay.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to Coates' encounter with Mr. Jaber, the survivor of the Ta-Nehisi massacre. His story really highlights the human cost of this conflict between Israel and Palestine and the trauma that's been passed down through generations of Palestinians.
The way Mr. Jaber talks about that day is just heartbreaking. He saw his brother brutally murdered and his family forced from their home. It makes you realize that behind all the political talk and historical accounts, there are real people whose lives have been destroyed by violence and displacement.
It's amazing how, even after going through something so awful, Mr. Jaber still has this incredible dignity and strength. He focuses on education as a way to resist and remember, to make sure his family's story and the stories of countless others who are forced from their homes are not forgotten.
His story shows how important it is to listen to and share the stories of people who've been marginalized and silenced. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to acknowledge injustice and fight against the stories that allow it to continue.
As we get closer to the end of the message, we see Coates realizing that trying to convince those in power to admit they're wrong might not work. He seems to be moving away from appealing to their sense of morality or justice and embracing a different kind of wisdom.
Yeah, it's interesting how he goes back to trusting his gut, the wisdom he got from growing up Black in Baltimore. He seems to be saying that there's some knowledge you can't get from books or numbers. It comes from lived experience, from the shared memory of people who've survived centuries of oppression.
It's this lived experience, this deep understanding of the world that comes from being part of a marginalized community that he leans on as he tries to make sense of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He's not trying to fit the story into something that's easy for a white audience to swallow. He's speaking from his own point of view, shaped by his own history and how his understanding of justice and injustice has changed.
And in doing that, he's challenging us, the readers, to do the same. He wants us to question the stories we've been told, to confront our own biases, and to use our voices to fight for a world that's fairer and more equal.
He's not pretending to have all the answers. He's inviting us to come along with him on this journey of learning, this search for truth and meaning that lasts a lifetime.
That's what makes the message so powerful and thought-provoking. It's not just a bunch of essays or travel stories. It's a deeply personal exploration of history, identity, and the power of storytelling.
In part 3, we'll finish up our deep dive into the message by talking about some of the main things we can take away from the book and exploring how these themes connect to our own lives and the bigger problems we face as a society today.
So we're back, wrapping up our deep dive into Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Message. Man, this book has really taken us on a journey from Howard University to Senegal, from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to, figuring out what it means to deal with history and who we are.
I know, right? It really pushes you to look at those hard truths, to question what you think you know, and just constantly look at yourself. And I think what really gets me is how open Coates is about his own struggles. He doesn't pretend to have it all figured out. He's right there with us, trying to understand these huge questions about history, justice, the whole deal.
And that makes his ideas even more powerful. He's inviting us to come along on this journey of figuring things out, to be open to changing our minds, and to be okay with being uncomfortable when we're growing and learning.
Totally. Remember how we talked about his changing view on reparations? At first, he presented it in a way he thought white people would get, using the example of Germany paying reparations to Israel after the Holocaust.
Right. But then, as he's traveling through Israel and Palestine, seeing the occupation firsthand, he starts to have second thoughts about that approach. He realizes that using one form of injustice to fix another isn't going to work in the long run.
It's a huge realization. He's admitting that even when we mean well, we can still end up supporting the very systems we're trying to change.
Yeah, it's a reminder that fighting for social justice takes constant work. We got to be willing to look at our own biases, the things we don't see, challenge what we think is true, and even change our minds.
And that process of challenging what we think we know, it can be uncomfortable. It forces us to face truths about ourselves, our past, and the world that maybe we've been avoiding.
But like Coates shows us, that discomfort is also where real growth happens. It's when we're willing to sit with those tough questions, wrestle with different ideas, and really challenge our own views, that we can start to build a fairer and more just world.
One of the biggest things I took away from the message is the power of stories. Coates sees them as a way to resist, to keep history alive, to challenge the stories that are already out there, and to connect with people who are different from us.
He wants us to tell our own stories, to speak up for those who haven't been heard, and to create new stories that show a world with more justice and compassion.
And he makes it clear that telling stories isn't just about sharing facts. It's about feeling the weight of history, understanding how our own experiences shape how we see the world, and recognizing how those experiences connect us to other people.
The message is a call to action. It's an invitation to do the hard but important work of understanding history, fighting injustice, and imagining a better future. It reminds us that we all have a part to play in shaping the stories that define our world.
If you're looking for a book that'll make you think, inspire you, and stick with you long after you've finished it, you gotta check out The Message. It'll get you talking, make you question what you think you know, and leave you with a sense of hope and possibility.
We'd love to hear what you think about The Message. What parts really hit home for you? What made you think differently? How has it changed how you see history, who you are, and the power of stories? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep searching for truth.